Iran War, the Monroe Doctrine, and the rapid militarization of the Indo-Pacific are not separate stories. They are three interlocking components of a single imperial strategy that was published in writing by the Pentagon itself. This strategy has a fatal structural flaw that almost nobody is discussing, and that flaw will determine whether America consolidates its position or accelerates its own decline within the next 4 years. On this channel, we do not do panic and we do not do cheerleading. We follow the logic of power. We follow the incentives. And when you strip away the emotion and the headlines, the picture always becomes clear. Let me start with the facts, because you need the ground beneath your feet before I take you into the analysis. On January 3, 2026, the United States launched a military operation in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolás Maduro and transporting him to New York to face federal charges. Within days, President Trump held a press conference declaring that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere would never be questioned again, invoking what his administration calls the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The National Security Strategy, published in late 2025, states, it explicitly, the United States will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or own strategically vital assets in the Western Hemisphere. Less than 2 months later, on February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and triggering the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global market. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Brent crude surged past $120 a barrel. Gulf oil production dropped by 10 million barrels a day within 2 weeks. The ceasefire brokered by Pakistan on April 7th held for roughly 10 weeks before collapsing in July. As of this week, the United States has reimposed its naval blockade on Iran, and Iranian forces have fired on commercial vessels in the strait. The Memorandum of Understanding signed in June is for all practical purposes dead. And while the world watched the Middle East burn, something equally significant happened with almost no fanfare. On January 15th, Japan and the Philippines signed 2 new defense agreements in Manila, an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement and an official security assistance pact. In May, 400 Japanese troops participated in the Balikatan exercises in the Philippines, marking the first time Japanese forces conducted live-fire military drills on Philippine soil since World War II. Australia is finalizing an agreement to build defense infrastructure at 5 locations in the Philippines. Japan's military budget for fiscal year 2026 hit 10.6 trillion yen, roughly $66.5 billion, pushing defense spending to 2% of GDP ahead of schedule. That reading, that these are 3 separate crises requiring 3 separate analyses, is not just shallow. It is dangerously wrong. To understand why, you first have to understand what I call the three-front architecture. The three-front architecture is a strategic pattern that emerges when an imperial power lacks the ground forces to control the world directly, but possesses overwhelming naval and air superiority. Instead of occupying territory, the empire controls the system by maintaining active pressure on 3 geographic fronts simultaneously, ensuring that no coalition of rivals can consolidate without confronting American power on at least one of those fronts. Think of it as a triangle. Each point of the triangle is a zone of controlled instability. The western vertex is the Western Hemisphere, locked down under the Monroe Doctrine. The southern vertex is the Middle East energy corridor, specifically the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. The eastern vertex is the Indo-Pacific, the arc running from Japan through the Philippines to Australia. Now here is the critical insight. The purpose of this architecture is not to win any of these individual conflicts. That is the wrong screen entirely. The purpose is to prevent Eurasian integration, because if Russia, China, Iran, India, and the Gulf states ever succeed in building an overland trade network that bypasses American-controlled sea lanes, the entire foundation of American financial supremacy, the dollar's reserve status, the enforceability of sanctions, the leverage that comes from controlling maritime choke points, all of it collapses. That is not a geopolitical theory. That is the structural logic published in the Pentagon's own National Defense Strategy. You can download it from the Department of Defense website and read it yourself. Now let me take you deeper, because this is where it gets genuinely alarming. The first front, the Western Hemisphere, is the foundation. Without hemispheric control, the other 2 fronts become unsustainable. The United States needs guaranteed access to resources in its own backyard, lithium from the triangle of Bolivia, Peru, and Chile, which supplies the majority of the world's lithium for semiconductors and electric vehicles, oil from Venezuela, which holds the largest proven crude reserves on Earth, agricultural output from Brazil and Argentina. What Trump has done is convert the Monroe Doctrine from a defensive warning against European interference into an active enforcement mechanism. The Venezuela operation was the proof of concept. The Cuba embargo is tightening. Colombia and Mexico have been explicitly threatened. China, which has been building ports and expanding trade links throughout South America for the past decade, has been told in no uncertain terms that access to Western Hemisphere resources now comes with an American toll. That is not a country responding to threats. That is a country establishing a resource perimeter. The second front, the Middle East, is the lever. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's maritime oil trade. Before the February strikes, approximately 25% of global crude and petroleum products and 19% of liquefied natural gas passed through that waterway. When Iran closed it, the International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Oil prices hit $100 a barrel within days. The World Bank estimated that Brent crude averaged $86 a barrel for 2026, with worst-case scenarios from Wood Mackenzie projecting prices approaching $200 a barrel if the strait remained closed through year-end. The Dallas Federal Reserve calculated that the disruption lowered global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter. Think about what that means. A single waterway, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, has the power to reshape the global economy. And right now, the United States is positioning itself as what President Trump called the guardian angel of that waterway, offering protection in exchange for payments and investment from Gulf states. Does that sound like a military operation, or does that sound like a protection racket with an aircraft carrier? Here is what almost nobody is telling you about the third front. While the Iran war consumed every headline, the Indo-Pacific underwent a structural transformation. Japan is no longer a pacifist bystander. In fiscal year 2026, Japan hit 2% of GDP in defense spending, ahead of the 2027 deadline it set for itself. Japan's defense ministry is examining selling Type 88 surface-to-ship missiles to the Philippines, the first time Japan has exported offensive weapons of this category. Australia has committed to purchasing Japanese Mogami-class frigates in what constitutes the largest defense industrial partnership in Tokyo's post-war history. The Philippines has signed visiting forces agreements with 5 countries and is openly building what analysts at the University of Tokyo describe as an unprecedented quasi-alliance structure. Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and the United States are now conducting coordinated maritime operations in the South China Sea. I want you to sit with this for a moment. Japan is rearming. The Philippines is becoming a forward operating base. Australia is integrating its naval procurement with Japanese shipbuilding. And all of this is happening while the world's attention is fixed on the Strait of Hormuz. That is not coincidence. That is the architecture functioning exactly as designed. The Middle East crisis absorbs China's bandwidth and diplomatic capital, while the containment ring tightens around it from the east. Now, before I continue, I want to present the strongest possible argument for the opposing side, because I owe you the real debate, not a simplified version. The Steelman case against the three-front architecture thesis is straightforward, and it has real merit. It goes like this. There is no grand design. The Venezuela operation was driven by Trump's personal political incentives, and the narco-terrorism charges were legitimate. The Iran strikes were a response to a genuine nuclear threat, compounded by a regime that massacred its own protesters. The Indo-Pacific alliances are natural responses by sovereign nations to Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. Each crisis has its own local logic, its own actors, its own dynamics. To see a unified architecture is to impose a pattern where only coincidence exists. I want to acknowledge that this argument is genuinely strong. Local incentives do drive individual decisions. Trump does have personal political motivations. Iran's nuclear program was a real threat. China is genuinely aggressive in the South China Sea. All of that is true. But the Steelman cannot explain one critical fact. It cannot explain why the 2025 National Security Strategy explicitly reorganizes American military posture around hemispheric control and maritime choke points simultaneously. It cannot explain why the Pentagon requested a $67 billion supplemental specifically for Iran operations, while simultaneously increasing Pacific Deterrence Initiative funding to $14.7 billion. It cannot explain why Japan's military transformation accelerated in the exact months when American attention was consumed by the Middle East. The Steelman describes each crisis accurately in isolation. It does not describe the system connecting them. And systems, not individual events, are where empires make their real moves. Here are my 3 predictions, numbered and falsifiable. Come back to this video in 6 months and tell me whether I was right or wrong. Prediction number 1. The Strait of Hormuz will not return to pre-war shipping levels by the end of 2026. Despite the Memorandum of Understanding, despite any future ceasefire, the United States will maintain some form of naval presence or control mechanism over the strait. The stated reason will be security. The structural reason is that controlling the world's most important energy choke point gives the United States permanent leverage over every oil importing nation on Earth: China, India, Japan, and Europe. Watch for the language to shift from temporary military operation to permanent security arrangement. That is the signal. Prediction number 2. Japan's defense spending will exceed 2.5% of GDP by fiscal year 2028. The current trajectory, supplementary budgets pushing past the official ceiling, the export of offensive weapons, the unprecedented participation in foreign military exercises. This is not a country maintaining a defensive posture. This is a country being positioned as the primary American proxy in the Pacific theater, the same way Israel functions as the American proxy in the Middle East. Watch for Japan to announce a formal defense cooperation agreement with Taiwan within the next 18 months. That will be the moment the third front locks into place. Prediction number 3. Watch for the actor that breaks the triangle. The three-front architecture requires cooperation from regional partners on every front: Gulf states in the Middle East, Japan and Australia in the Pacific, compliant governments in Latin America. The weakest link is not military, it is political. Watch Pakistan, which brokered the Iran ceasefire but has its own strategic relationship with China. Watch Turkey, which is a NATO member but has refused to align against Iran. Watch Brazil, which is a BRICS member being told it cannot trade freely with China in its own hemisphere. The first partner to defect from the architecture will signal which front collapses first. And that defection will come not from ideology, but from economic self-interest, because the cost of sustaining three simultaneous fronts is not just military, it is financial. And that brings us back to the 2 numbers I asked you to memorize. Here are 3 things I want you to watch in the coming weeks. First, watch the Strait of Hormuz ship traffic data. Marine traffic publishes daily transit numbers. The pre-war average was roughly 40 to 50 vessels per day. As of last week, only 6 vessels transited in a 24-hour period. When that number starts climbing back, the crisis is easing. If it stays suppressed while the United States announces a permanent naval presence, the architecture is locking into place. That is your early warning signal. Second, watch Japan's supplementary defense budget this autumn. The initial budget already hit 2% of GDP. If a supplementary budget pushes it higher, and there are strong indications it will, that tells you the Pacific Front is accelerating on a timeline faster than anyone publicly acknowledges. Third, and this is the one that affects you directly, watch energy prices and the dollar. The Strait of Hormuz crisis has already pushed oil above $100 a barrel. The Dallas Fed estimates that if the disruption persists for 3 quarters, prices could reach $132 a barrel by year-end, with U.S. inflation rising by up to 0.32 percentage points on top of existing pressures. That is not an abstraction. That is your grocery bill. That is your fuel cost. That is the purchasing power of every dollar in your savings account being quietly eroded while the architecture operates. And if you want the 47 specific strategies for hedging your household wealth, cutting your inflation exposure, and reading the 5 signals that tell you the truth before any headline does, I put everything into the Crisis Preparation Blueprint. It is the personal finance chapter that the geopolitical analysis never includes. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. 47 strategies. The full system. Most households recover the cost in the first week. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Every empire in history has faced the same dilemma. The cost of maintaining dominance eventually exceeds the wealth that dominance generates. Rome discovered this. Britain discovered this. The Soviet Union discovered this. The United States is now spending over $1 trillion a year on defense. Its national debt has crossed $39.5 trillion. The interest payments alone, the cost of servicing past borrowing, now consume nearly 14% of all federal outlays. The three-front